Okay, so, like, what even is good for a whole group of people? And where do you get the right, like, the moral justification to use power to make that good happen? That's a pretty heady question, classic philosophy territory. But it's also the heart of what we're tackling today,
Yeah.
the ethics of public health.
Yeah.
And for anyone listening, especially if you've got that philosophy background, this is where things get really interesting. We're talking about justice, legitimacy, individual freedom, bumping up against the needs of the many, all playing out in the very real world of trying to keep people healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. That tension you're talking about, it's everywhere in public health ethics.
Right.
So what we're doing in this deep dive is like a dissection, right? We're going to lay bare those ethical dilemmas, those really knotty intellectual challenges that come with public health. And to guide us, we've got this awesome resource, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on public health ethics. It's really insightful in how it breaks down the philosophical puzzles you get when you stop focusing on just one person and start thinking about like the well-being of whole groups. And that's what public health is all about: communities, populations, how to improve their health. And so often that means government action, which is, for a philosophical mind, like instant red flags and warning bells going off.
Yeah, I can see that. So, like, straight off the bat, what even makes public health ethics its own thing? I mean, ethics are ethics, right? Are they different in this field?
Definitely. The big one is the focus. Public health is all about collectives, populations, communities. It's not like clinical ethics where you're mostly worried about one patient at a time. In a hospital, health is like a private thing, you and your doctor. But in public health, it's everyone's business. It's a good that belongs to the whole group.
So it's not just adding up everybody's individual health, and that's the community's health.
No, it's bigger than that. There's this idea called anti-reductionism. Basically, it says you can't just look at each person in a vacuum and understand the whole group's health. There are these things like how connected people are or how much they trust each other that affect everyone's health, not just one person. Think about it like a support group for folks who are struggling that helps everyone in the group, not just each person by themselves. Or like clean water projects. That's not just about you having clean water. It's about the whole system being clean. Philosophically, it's kind of like holism, the whole being greater than the sum of its parts.
Gotcha. Like a choir. One voice is cool, but when they all blend. And this public goods idea, how does that fit in?
That's key. In economics, a public good is something everyone can enjoy, and one person using it doesn't stop others from using it, like a park, right?
Okay, yeah.
And public health has tons of these. Herd immunity is a perfect example. You get enough people vaccinated, and it creates this shield, even for those who can't be vaccinated. Or sanitation, clean air. It's hard to keep anyone from benefiting, even if they didn't do anything to help. Now, not everything in public health fits that economic definition perfectly.
Right.
But it shows why we need to work together, often with the government stepping in. Individual choices alone, they won't get us herd immunity or clean air for everyone.
Right. You can't just hope everyone will be responsible enough to get vaccinated on their own, especially if some folks think vaccines are bad. And that brings us to this big thing, government getting involved in public health.
Exactly. To make these big changes, you usually need the government to flex its muscles a bit. Think about things like mass vaccination drives, making sure food and water are safe, or dealing with pollution. You need that government power, those resources. Some folks even say that's the whole point of calling it public health.
Interesting.
It's not just that it's owned at everyone, but that it's the government's job to make it happen.
Okay. But our outline mentioned there's debate about this. Does public health always mean the government's got to be the one doing it? What about all the NGOs and international groups like the WHO?
You're right. It's not that simple. The government's often the big player, but it's not a solo act. We've got NGOs, foundations, and yeah, the WHO doing a ton of stuff that's clearly public health.
Right. Like, wasn't it the Gates Foundation that did a lot to fight polio?
Exactly. And Doctors Without Borders responding to epidemics all over the place. These aren't government, but they're definitely impacting global health. It'd be pretty narrow-minded to say they're not doing public health just because they're not the state.
Yeah, totally. They're still working for the health of populations, even if they're organized differently.
Right. Now, you could argue about legitimacy, like NGOs, they aren't elected. They don't answer to the people the way a government does. That's a real concern, especially with big NGOs having so much sway over health priorities that maybe should be decided by, actual governments. But that argument gets a bit weaker when these NGOs are actually partnering with governments or working in places where the government's just not functioning.
Yeah, I see it.
And the WHO, they're global. They're essential to public health, but they're not under any one country's control.
So government's usually the big dog, especially for like coordinating things and making those incentives work. But it's not the only game in town. Which brings us to this biggie, justice. What are the moral principles behind all this?
Yeah, here's where things get really philosophical, especially for someone like you who's into this stuff.
Yeah.
Public health ethics is like soaked in theories of justice. The first question is, why do we even care about health? Why is it so important, morally speaking? Well, there are different schools of thought. You've got utilitarianism, where it's all about maximizing happiness, and health helps with that.
Yeah.
A healthier population gets more done. You know, they're happier overall. Then you've got egalitarianism, where it's about fairness. Everyone should have a shot at being healthy because it's a basic need, like having food or shelter. Inequalities in health. That's just wrong from this viewpoint. And then there's the human rights perspective, which is like everyone deserves to be healthy. It's a right, not a privilege.
Yeah.
And that puts the responsibility on governments to make sure that happens.
So depending on which of those ideas you agree with, you might have a different reason for pushing public health measures.
Exactly. And it changes how we think about things like what our health goals should be and how we spend the limited money we have. Which brings us to this tricky thing. Looking at health data for the whole population.
Okay.
Public health, it loves its numbers. Average life expectancy, overall death rates, big picture stuff.
Right.
But the problem is these averages, they can hide huge inequalities within the population. It's like you're missing pieces of the puzzle.
Like the average lifespan might be going up, but certain groups are still lagging way behind.
Exactly. Focusing only on the big average can make you miss injustices that are happening to specific groups. Like, if you only look at a country's average income to decide who gets health aid, you might miss communities that are super poor, even though the country as a whole looks pretty well off. Public health ethics has got to watch out for this all the time, Data can lie if you're not careful.
And then there are those fancy measures of population health, like QALYs and dailies.
Yeah.
Those have gotten some side-eye from ethicists too, right?
Oh, yeah. They try to boil down life expectancy and the impact of disease and disability into one neat number. The idea is to help with making policy decisions and figuring out where to spend money.
Makes sense in theory, I guess.
But they've gotten a lot of pushback. Some people say they're too focused on individual preferences, like what you think is a good quality of life might be different from what I think. And when you try to combine all those preferences, you can end up hiding disagreements about what's really important. And there's a big worry that these measures could actually end up discriminating against certain groups, especially folks with disabilities, by saying their lives are somehow less valuable.
So it's not just about getting the highest QALY score for everyone and calling it a day.
No, not at all. And that brings us to this constant tug of war between efficiency, like getting the most bang for your buck with health interventions, and equity, actually making things fairer for the groups that are getting a raw deal. Now, being efficient is important, of course. But if you only care about efficiency, you might end up helping the people who are already better off, Like, investing in a new treatment that only wealthy people can afford might improve overall health numbers, but it doesn't do much for those who can't access it. This is where those other ideas about fairness come in, like prioritizing the worst off or making sure everyone has at least a basic level of health. It's a tough choice, and it comes up all the time. Like, do you focus on getting the most babies to survive, or do you focus on closing the gap between how many black babies die versus white babies?
Yeah, that's a heavy decision. And what about when, like, a public health measure helps one group, but another group has to bear the cost? The outline gave the example of vaccinating kids against the flu.
Yeah, that's another tricky one. In those cases, you're vaccinating kids not just for them, but to protect older or weaker people. Or like with the rubella vaccine, where the goal is to protect pregnant women. And you've got to ask, is it okay to ask one group to take on a risk, even a small one, for the sake of another group? People who say yes often talk about reciprocity. We all benefit from these kinds of shared actions over time.
Like, I get vaccinated to protect you, you get vaccinated to protect me.
Exactly. But that doesn't work so well if you're the very first group to have to do something. Another argument is that these measures even out the burden of disease. Everyone shares the risk more fairly. But there's a limit to how much we can ask people to sacrifice for others' health. And some might even say that health burdens just aren't the kind of thing we should be trading back and forth like that.
Okay, that makes sense. Public health is also all about preventing stuff, right? Not just treating what's already there, but stopping things before they become a problem.
Right.
Does justice have anything to say about that?
Oh, for sure. Prevention brings up a whole new set of ethical problems. We've got these things called the identified victim effect and the rule of rescue. It's basically that we're hardwired to help someone who's right in front of us, who's suffering more than we are, to help someone who might suffer in the future.
Yeah, that's understandable, right? Like you see a kid drowning, you jump in. You don't stop to think about the statistics of how many kids drown each year.
Right. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it creates this conflict with long-term goals. It makes you ask, is it morally right to put today's problems ahead of tomorrow's? And what happens when you need people who are already struggling to take part in something that's supposed to help everyone in the future? Is that fair to ask them to focus on the long game when their immediate needs aren't being met?
That does seem kind of messed up.
Uh,
Let's talk about personal responsibility, which is always a hot topic. How does justice square with the idea that you're responsible for your own health choices?
Now, this is where those philosophical heavy hitters like luck egalitarianism come into play.
Okay, remind me about that one.
It basically says that inequalities are only wrong if they happen because of bad luck, stuff you can't control. If you make a dumb choice and that screws you over, well, that's on you. So some people would argue that if you're unhealthy because you made bad choices, it's more like charity, not justice, to help you. But this view is really limited. It ignores the fact that unhealthy choices are often way more common in groups that are already disadvantaged.
Right, because your choices aren't made in a vacuum. If you're poor and stressed and you can't afford healthy food, it's not as simple as just making better choices.
Exactly. You've got poverty, you've got limited access to good food, you've got stress from constantly facing discrimination. All of that pushes people towards choices that make them unhealthy. And from a justice standpoint, blaming people for that is just wrong. It's like blaming the victim. And it goes against what a lot of us see as the core purpose of public health, which is to fix those unfair differences in health. Like the former head of the WHO said it perfectly. The biggest factor in whether you're healthy or not is the social conditions you're born into, the environment you grow up in, the work you do, and how you age. So when someone's bad health is tied to those bigger injustices, you can't just point the finger at them and say it's all their fault.
So that leads us to stigma, which is a huge problem in public health. Where does justice come into that?
Stigma happens when people label certain traits or behaviors as bad or undesirable, and that leads to those folks being pushed to the margins. They lose their status. From a justice point of view, especially when it's the government doing the stigmatizing, that's a major problem. It makes existing inequalities worse, keeps those power imbalances going, and basically says those people aren't worthy of respect.
Yeah, I can see that. Like, if the government says a certain group is high risk for something, and that something has a lot of stigma attached to it,
It can backfire big time.
even if the goal was to help, right?
Exactly. It might seem efficient to just focus on those high-risk folks, but if that ends up making people think even worse of them, then you're screwing up big time when it comes to fairness.
Makes sense.
So public health officials are always walking this tightrope. Do they focus narrowly and risk more stigma, or do they go broad, which might be less efficient but avoids that harm?
Tough call.
And then there are those public health campaigns that intentionally use stigma, like trying to make smoking or eating junk food seem gross or shameful. The goal is to reduce harm, but the ethics of that are complicated. Like, is it ever okay to make people feel bad about themselves to get them to make better choices?
Not sure about that one. And when we're talking justice and public health, we can't forget the global picture. The differences in health between rich and poor countries are, well, they're shocking.
Absolutely. Public health doesn't stop at borders. And yeah, there are practical reasons for that, like how easily diseases can spread. But when you look at how much longer people in rich countries live, how much healthier they are, that's a huge injustice on a global scale. It brings up all these questions about what we owe to people in other countries, even if they're far away. Like, if we all agree that health is a basic human right, then who's responsible for making that a reality?
Yeah, is it just each country for its own citizens? Or does the whole world have a duty to help?
Right. And even if we say it's each country's job, what happens when governments fail? Fixing global health disparities means tackling all the root causes.
Yeah.
Poverty, lack of education, environmental damage. It's not just about medicine.
So justice and public health is this massive, multifaceted thing. It's about individuals, communities, and the whole world. Okay,
Right.
so we've talked about justice. Now let's switch gears to this whole question of political legitimacy. What gives the government the authority to, make public health rules, especially when some of those rules can really restrict what people can do.
That's the other big pillar of public health ethics legitimacy. Can the government really tell us what to do when it comes to our health? Because it's the government that's often making and enforcing these rules, we've got to be extra careful about whether they have the right to do that.
Okay, that makes sense.
So it's this constant balancing act between what's good for everyone and individual freedom and, the whole can of worms that is paternalism.
Yeah, that one's always a doozy.
One argument for the government's authority is that public health institutions do things that we just can't do on our own. Like, they protect us in ways we couldn't manage individually.
Okay, so what kinds of things are we talking about?
Think about stopping a huge outbreak, like a pandemic, or making sure medicines are safe and actually work. These are things we all want, but we can't do it alone. We don't have the know-how, the resources, or the power to make everyone cooperate. So we create these agencies like public health departments and regulatory bodies to do it for us.
Like, we give up a little bit of our own freedom to be safe and healthy as a group.
Exactly. The idea is that having these public health systems benefits everyone in the long run, even if some people don't like every single rule or feel like they're being told what to do.
Yeah, I get that. And this ties into that idea of public health being a collective action problem. Like,
Yeah.
we all got to work together for it to work.
Precisely. A lot of big public health goals, like stopping the spread of a disease or making roads safer, only work if most people participate. If enough folks opt out, like refusing to vaccinate or ignoring traffic laws, the whole system breaks down and everyone gets hurt.
It's like the whole tragedy of the commons thing. If everyone acts selfishly, everyone loses in the end.
Right. So you can see why the government steps in, sometimes even forcing people to comply. It's about ensuring that everyone plays their part for the common good, even if it means limiting individual choice.
And when you're talking about super complex stuff like food safety or pollution, it's not just about coordinating people's actions, right? It's also that most of us just don't know enough to make informed choices all the time.
Absolutely. No one can be an expert on everything. You can't scrutinize every ingredient on a food label or test your water for contaminants every day. So it makes sense to have government agencies with experts who can handle that stuff.
Makes sense.
And don't forget about those big companies trying to make a profit, sometimes at the expense of our health. It's a lot easier for them to manipulate people who don't have all the information.
Right, because it's hard to make rational choices when you're being bombarded with misleading advertising.
Exactly. So these collective efficiency arguments say that it's both smart and fair to have the government look out for us, kind of like how we have police for safety and the military for protection from outside threats. But while arguments about efficiency and overall benefit are important, they're not a blank check for the government to do whatever it wants. We still need ethical frameworks and checks and balances to make sure those powers are being used justly and for the right reasons.
Which brings us to, the biggest tension here. Individual freedom. Public health measures can be pretty intrusive. We've got things like mandatory screenings, quarantine during outbreaks. How do you square those things with the government's authority, especially in a society that values freedom so much?
Yeah, that's the heart of the debate from a liberal perspective.
Okay.
Public health and individual liberty are often pulling in opposite directions. There's this model called the Nuffield ladder that ranks how much different policies interfere with people's choices.
Like from just giving information at the bottom to forcing people to do stuff at the top.
Exactly. And liberals have come up with all these different ways to think about this tension. We could start with paternalism, which is always a controversial one.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So what's the deal with paternalism? Because it sounds kind of, I don't know, like Big Brother-ish.
It can be, yeah. It's basically when the government steps in and limits your freedom for your own good. Hard paternalism is when they do that, even if you disagree and you're a competent adult. That's generally a no-go in liberal thought because it disrespects your autonomy.
Makes sense.
But then there's soft paternalism, where the government just tries to make sure you're making choices based on good information and you're not being coerced or manipulated.
Okay, yeah, that seems a little more reasonable.
Right. Think about warning labels on cigarettes. They're not stopping you from smoking, but they're making sure you know the risks.
Right.
No, with any kind of paternalism, the tricky part is figuring out when it's actually okay for the government to overrule someone's choice, especially when that choice, even if it's unhealthy, isn't hurting anyone else. And we got to think about how to respect choices made by people whose autonomy might be compromised, like someone who's addicted to something.
That's a good point. If you're struggling with addiction, can you really say you're making a truly free choice?
Exactly. And a lot of arguments for intervening with teens or people with addictions are based on this idea that their ability to make free choices is, not fully there. So good paternalism, especially the softer kind, shouldn't be about forcing people to do what the government thinks is best. It should be about making sure they're making genuine choices based on accurate information.
Okay, so focus on making sure people are informed and in control, not just pushing the right choices. What about that harm principle thing? That seems relevant here.
Oh, for sure. That's John Stuart Mill's idea.
Right, right.
It basically says the government can only step in and mess with your freedom if you're going to hurt someone else.
Makes sense.
In public health, this is often used to justify things like mandatory vaccines, right? Because if you're not vaccinated, you could get other people sick, especially folks who are vulnerable and can't get vaccinated themselves. But actually, using this principle is hard. What counts as harm is tricky, and sometimes it's hard to say whether an action is only affecting you or if it's affecting others, too.
Like, if I eat a ton of junk food and get sick, that's my problem.
Yeah, but if you end up needing expensive medical care that's paid for by everyone's taxes, then maybe it is harming others, at least indirectly.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's all connected, isn't it? Now, there's also that liberty tradition that's pretty skeptical of government, especially when it comes to health, right?
Yeah, they really value individual freedom. They're super wary of the government overstepping its bounds because they don't think the government's always competent or trustworthy.
Okay.
They argue that even if people make bad choices for their health, the government's probably no better at making those choices for them. They push back against a lot of public health measures, from things like food labeling and sugar taxes to stuff like regulating what drugs people can buy. Mandatory vaccination, that's a big sticking point for them. They're all about freedom of choice, and some struggle to balance that with the need to keep everyone safe from contagious diseases.
So they probably wouldn't be fans of those vaccine mandates. Too much government interference.
Pretty much. Some might say that letting your kid go unvaccinated harms other people by spreading disease. But then you have to think about whether other risky behaviors should be restricted too, if you're going to be consistent.
Yeah, that opens a whole other can of worms. Now,
Yeah.
what about libertarian paternalism? That sounds like they're trying to have their cake and eat it too.
Right, that's the idea behind it. It's this idea that you can nudge people towards healthy choices without actually taking away their freedom.
Okay, how does that work?
You use these nudges, which are basically ways to make the healthy choice easier or more appealing without banning the unhealthy choice.
So, like putting the fruit at eye level in the cafeteria instead of hiding it behind the chips.
Exactly. Or automatically signing people up for a retirement savings plan, but giving them the option to opt out. You're influencing their behavior, but you're not forcing them.
Clever.
The goal is to make people healthier and happier while respecting their freedom. But of course, it's got its critics. Some say it's still manipulative, even if it's subtle, and that nudges just aren't strong enough to tackle the big problems like poverty or inequality. And then you've got the hardcore libertarians who think any government interference, even a nudge, is a step too far.
And it sounds like there's no easy answer here, even if you're generally in favor of freedom and limited government.
Definitely not. So even within liberal political philosophy, you've got this whole spectrum of views on how much the government should be involved in public health, which brings us to the question of what happens when people just disagree. What's the government supposed to do when its citizens have different values and beliefs about what's good for their health?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's not like there's one right answer that everyone agrees on.
Right. And that's where this idea of public reason comes in. It's this idea that the government should only make policies based on reasons that all reasonable people could accept, even if they have different beliefs. So when there are these big disagreements about values or the best way to achieve public health goals, the challenge for policymakers is to find some common ground. They got to come up with justifications that make sense to most people, even if they don't agree on every detail.
Like appealing to shared values or using logic that most folks would find sound.
Exactly. It's about finding those principles that can bridge those divides.
And the outline mentioned something called accountability for reasonableness. What's that all about?
Yeah. That's this framework developed by Norman Daniels and James Sabin for making decisions when everyone just can't agree on the substance, the what of the decision.
Okay.
Their idea is that it's often easier to get people to agree on the process, how we make decisions, than on the actual outcome.
Like if everyone feels like the process is fair, they're more likely to accept the decision, even if they don't love it.
Right. Accountability for reasonableness lays out 4 conditions for making legitimate decisions. 1, everyone knows the reasons behind the decision. 2, Those reasons are relevant to people's health needs. 3, people can challenge and try to change the decision. And 4, there's some oversight to make sure the process is being followed properly.
Sounds pretty sensible.
It's been influential, but it's also got its critics. Some people question whether agreeing on the process is really easier than agreeing on the values. And there are questions about what counts as a fair-minded reason in a society where people are so divided.
So even figuring out how to disagree fairly is a whole philosophical debate in itself. Finally, the outline briefly mentioned alternatives to liberalism, like different ways of thinking about political legitimacy in public health. They mentioned something called civic republicanism.
Yeah, some folks argue that non-liberal traditions can offer some fresh insights. Like, civic republicanism isn't so focused on individual freedom as just being left alone.
Okay.
They're more concerned with freedom from domination, not being controlled by others.
Interesting.
And in that view, some public health interventions, especially those that tackle inequality or corporate power, can actually increase freedom. They're preventing some people from being exploited by others.
Like by making sure workplaces are safe or cracking down on misleading advertising.
Exactly. Public health agencies, in this view, aren't just about stopping disease. They're about creating a society where everyone is truly free and equal.
That's a different way of looking at it.
But like all philosophies, republicanism has its issues too. There are concerns about how much it might limit individual choices in the name of the common good. And there are questions about whether we can even agree on what the common good is in a diverse society.
Right. Whose common good are we talking about?
Exactly. Plus, there's this tension between the way public health agencies actually work, which can be very technical and bureaucratic, and the Republican ideal of citizens directly participating in decision-making.
So it seems like there's no one-size-fits-all philosophy to guide us through all these ethical dilemmas in public health. It's more like we're constantly weighing different values, considering different perspectives.
Exactly. Public health ethics is such a rich field because it forces us to think hard about those fundamental values that often clash. Individual freedom versus the well-being of the group, efficiency versus equity, and how to balance all those different ideas about what makes a good life.
Yeah, so much to ponder. So for all our listeners out there, especially those of you who love a good philosophical puzzle, here's something to chew on. If we live in a society where people believe all sorts of different things, what are the core principles that should guide us when we're making public health policies? When does the government have the right to act? And how do we make sure it respects individual freedom while protecting everyone's health? It's a question that's right at the crossroads of ethics, political philosophy, and the health of our communities. And it's a question that demands our constant attention and critical thinking.